Hi, you're watching theAnalysis-news, and I'm Talia Baroncelli. I'll shortly be joined by journalist Jonathan M. Katz to speak about his book, Gangsters of Capitalism, and the Marine Smedley Butler. If you'd like to support us, you can go to our website, theAnalysis.news, hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen, and get onto our mailing list. That way, you're always up to date every time we publish a new episode. Like and subscribe to this show on YouTube, Spotify, and on Apple if you can. And see you in a bit with Jonathan M. Katz. I'm very excited to be joined by Jonathan M. Katz. He's a journalist and author of the book, The Big Truck That Went By, How the World Came to Save Haiti and Left Behind a Disaster. His second book, which we'll be discussing today, is called Gangsters of Capitalism, Smedley Butler, the Marines, and the Making and Breaking of America's Empire. So thanks so much for joining us again, Jonathan. It's great to have you back.
It's wonderful to be here.
So your book speaks about Smedley Butler, who is the highest decorated Marine in U.S. history. He was involved in numerous U.S. military expeditions in Cuba, in the Philippines, northern China, Nicaragua, Haiti, as well as in France during the First World War and numerous other places. So after the First World War, he began giving lectures on the dangers of U.S. militarism and war profiteering. And these lectures actually formed the basis for a pamphlet which he wrote in 1935 called War is a Racket, and that particular pamphlet traced the links between war and big business and war profiteering. So we'll at some point get to a foiled coup plot called the Business Plot in 1933 going into 1934. But before we speak about that, why don't we speak about who Smedley was? He was born in Westchester in Pennsylvania to a senator. He grew up as a Quaker. So what else can you tell us about his upbringing?
Yeah, congressman his father was, but yes,
Okay.
Exactly. His father was a very prominent person in the country at the time. Yeah, he grew up a rich kid in suburban Philadelphia, just off the main line, if anybody knows Philly, from a old Pennsylvania Quaker family. His family had been very involved in banking, railroads. His mother's family actually was the side that had the money. The Darlington family. His full name was Smedley Darlington Butler. He was named for his grandfather, Smedley Darlington, who was the congressman for the district, who then retired and basically handed his seat to his son-in-law, who was Smedley's father. The Darlingtons were the power in the area. And actually, if you go to Westchester today, there's still a fair amount of stuff in town named for the Darlingtons. He went to school on the main line at the Haverford. It was now called the Haverford School, still exists. At the time, it was called the Haverford College Grammar School. It's basically on the campus. It shares a campus with Haverford College, which is a Quaker college. And he effectively dropped out of school. He actually got his diploma mailed to him at the end. But he effectively dropped out of school and stopped his education in 1898 to join the Marines to fight in Cuba in what Americans know as the Spanish-American War. Cubans know as the War of Independence or the Spanish-Cuban-American War, and Filipinos, who Smedley also ended up getting involved with, going to the Philippines, and it's actually spent a lot of time there. The full name of it is the Spanish-Filipino-Cuban-American War, right? Also Puerto Rico's involved.
Right.
This is a war in which America really becomes an overseas empire. And Butler lies about his age. He's 16 years old, but the Marines are desperate. They'll take anybody they can get. And they ship him to Cuba, to a little garden spot known as Guantanamo Bay, which the Americans had just seized a couple weeks earlier. And from there, Butler basically goes on a world tour. He goes everywhere that the flag goes, everywhere that the Marines go, everywhere that the United States gets involved in an overseas conflict, occupation, invasion, or war, with just one or two minor exceptions, from 1898 until the 1930s, until the eve of World War II. So yeah, he starts off as a rich Quaker, and then basically goes in a direction that a lot of Quakers don't go in, which is he joins the military.
Yeah, he really wanted to see combat, and he was completely convinced by this idea of the white man, fighting in other parts of the world, trying to bring about, freedom, but also prosperity to the United States. And so he was involved in numerous U.S. colonial expeditions. He fully bought into this idea of American empire and of exploiting racialized populations. And
he's really, I mean, if like reading his letters, which was a huge source for my research for the book, also some of the memoirs that he wrote or participated in at the end of his life, it's very clear that he was very radicalized by the destruction of the battleship Maine, which people often hear about in school. But the Maine was one of two steel battleships in the U.S. Navy at the time, and it went to Cuba as a show of force to protect American businesses. But most Americans didn't really understand why it was there. All they knew was that it was blown up. It was destroyed in Havana Harbor and sunk with 260 some American sailors and Marines aboard. And a lot of Americans, it actually, contrary to common popular belief, it wasn't really the U.S. government that blamed the Spanish. It was sort of American popular opinion, American newspapers, either directly implied or believed that Spain was responsible for it. There was also, there's a lot of parallels here to 9/11.
Right.
His anniversary just passed.
Yeah.
In that, it's a casus belli, right? So like it plunges like especially a young generation of Americans. It gives them sort of this jingoistic war fever, and it makes them eager for war and revenge. No one's really asking a lot of questions about like why was this situation the way it was, that like this happened in the first place. And but the other thing that I think is somewhat that it has in common, which complicates some of the narratives, especially in some of the narratives, some of the basic narratives on the left, is that Spain, which was the colonizing power in Cuba, it had owned Cuba as a colony since Christopher Columbus dropped an anchor there in 1494, was a horrible colonial empire, and it was doing horrific things. And one of the things that Spain was doing that really radicalized a lot of Americans who were reading newspapers at the time was that they invented concentration camps to crush the Cuban independence movement. Cubans have been trying to fight for their independence for 30 years at this point. And the war that America ends up getting involved in had actually started, the acute war has started in 1895, so just before. So this is a little bit, there is some similarity there to like Saddam Hussein was really a bad guy.
Yeah.
Al-Qaeda is really like a bad malevolent force. And so Spain, who the United States was going to war against, like they actually weren't good people. Like it wasn't like Spain was innocent and the United States, just framed them and went to war against them. But just as in the forever wars, just as in the post 9/11 moment, which in some ways we're still in, it wasn't. It was sold to the American people as like, we need to do this as a war for democracy. We need to do this as a war to free little Cuba, is the way that Smedley Butler remembered it. He said, I wanted to shoulder a rifle and free little Cuba in a very paternalistic sense. But from the point of view of the U.S. government, they had, significant business interests in Cuba. And once it became clear that there were these other Spanish colonies all over the world, the Philippines being the biggest, also Puerto Rico, Guam, all of which ended up being part of the U.S. empire. The Philippines got their independence in 1946. But they had their own ulterior motives. But for a kid like Smedley, who was, he was 16, he didn't know any of that. And so he just went and, just got a big old swig of the Kool-Aid. And then when he was in the field, when he was in Cuba, and then especially when he gets sent to his next assignment, which is the Philippines, just in time. So the U.S. has just annexed the Philippines, and the Filipinos aren't happy about that because the U.S. fought on the side of both the Filipinos and the Cubans and then betrayed both of them.
Right. I mean, just to highlight this one point, I mean, initially, the Americans said that they were going into Cuba to fight alongside the Cubans against the Spanish. But then there's a racial element there because when they saw the Cubans and saw that, many of them were of African descent, for example, and they, they're visibly darker, then they started to think that, oh, well, maybe we can oppress them and exploit them instead. So they turned on the native populations there in order to actually try to make it a project of U.S. empire to then benefit the U.S. And it sort of plays into what someone like CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou would say, I believed America could do no wrong. I mean, this is what Smedley Butler was essentially believing. He was fully indoctrinated. He went to these various places, and he really did believe that, brown people or Black people should be civilized, quote unquote, civilized for people who are listening. And that it was, America's right in a way to actually annex land or to, take abaca or bananas or whatever other raw materials or resources were there, even if it meant using techniques such as concentration, harassment, putting people in concentration camps. And that was all justified.
The Americans go to war with Spain, and part of the reason for the war, the Maine is the most famous, but part of the reason is because Spain is operating concentration camps. In Spanish, it's known as reconcentración. So they're operating these reconcentrado pens, and then the Americans open their own concentration camps in the Philippines. They learn the technique from the Spanish. They also, by the way, in the Philippines, learn waterboarding. It's actually a much more brutal, earlier form of waterboarding in which people were much more likely to die. And because of the different ways that sort of the internal politics and the ways in which within the United States there was a significant caucus that didn't want to become an overseas empire. They didn't want overseas colonies. So they wrote into the Declaration of War of Spain a provision which said that Cuba wouldn't become an American colony.
Right. That was Senator Teller's amendment, right?
Exactly. So Cuba becomes a client state instead. Instead, we basically install a public government and ensure that we maintain control over Guantanamo Bay. But then the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico, there's no such provision. So all of those just become U.S. colonies with the help of the Marines and Smedley Butler.
Right. And there was another general, I can't remember his name. I think it was Jacob Smith. He was someone who was really famous for his 27 years in the U.S. and fighting the indigenous population and fighting the Native Americans. And so he developed these or implemented these techniques, if you will, of concentration, of harassment. And then he was hired to actually go to the Philippines and use those same techniques on the local populations there. So in a sense, you could see the Native populations in the U.S. as forming technological testing grounds, kind of similar to what's going on in the Middle East right now, in Gaza, where the Israelis, they develop all these different weapons using AI and surveillance. They test them on the Palestinians, and then these techniques and these weapons are sold to other countries for them to then use it on their own populations. I mean, this is being done in the EU, in the Central Mediterranean, as well as along the U.S.-Mexico border. So could you speak a bit more about that particular technique, which was, honing these techniques in North America and then expropriating them and exporting them rather abroad?
Yeah. So, I mean, it wasn't just Smith who was horrific, and he factors into a chapter on it's a really horrific chapter in both my book and also in American history on a specific Filipino island in the Philippines called Samar.
Yeah.
Where
it's brutal.
There's basically a guerrilla massacre of occupying U.S. troops who have been harassing and taking advantage of, and there are rumors of sexual assault and things like this. There's a by the Americans against the local population in a town called Balangiga. The Balangiga known locals and also some other guerrillas from other places in the Philippines attack the Americans, massacre a bunch of them at breakfast one morning.
Yeah, like 47 of them or something.
I think that's the number, yeah. And then basically the Americans go on just an orgy of revenge. They launch an enormous revenge massacre, which is still known in Marine Corps lore, especially as the March on Samar. And Butler actually isn't involved in that personally because he would have been there because his unit essentially is part of it. He was in China right before that, suppressing the Boxer Rebellion. And he contracted typhoid, ended up getting sent home. But yeah, so Smith is sent in to oversee that and issues a notorious order to basically kill every male on the island over the age of 10, which is not followed to the letter, but it certainly helps set the tone for what happens. But it's not just Smith. I mean, the entire officer class of the military, especially at the beginning of this period, they all came up through what is known in America and U.S. history as the Indian Wars, the wars of ethnic cleansing and displacement and concentration and harassment against the native peoples, especially in the Western United States. Adnot Chafee, who's a very important military leader, he's also he's an army officer. He's also the general in charge of the invasion of China and the Boxer Rebellion. He also came up through that war. All of Smedley's, like all of the old men who Smedley is serving under at the beginning, all of them, the oldest of them actually fought in the Civil War, because it was 30 years before at that point. But in the time between the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War, and this period that we're talking about, the main task of the U.S. military was fighting native peoples, fighting the Lakota, fighting the Diné, fighting the Apache, the Comanche, like all of those wars. And they hone these tactics, and then they use them, they employ them in the field. The Philippines is in a lot of ways the biggest cauldron of that, although there are other examples. There are other examples of like colonial warfare tactics that the Americans are using. The Americans are also learning from other empires.
Right.
The Americans, especially in China, fight alongside the British, the French, the Germans,
the Russians too, right?
Russians, yeah, the Italians, the Austrians, the Japanese in that particular war. I feel like I'm forgetting one, but it doesn't matter.
Japanese, you say that?
The Japanese we're fighting alongside the Japanese in China in 1900. And so we're learning, especially from the British and the French, a lot of their colonial techniques as well, techniques that they've been honing in centuries of colonial warfare, but especially in terms of modern warfare at that time in Africa, especially, and also Asia. And sometimes they're learning these techniques alongside the Americans at the same time. One of the lesser known findings of my book, and I think my book is still, the first place that put this together. It seems I found very clear evidence that the British employed chemical weapons in China in 1900, which is 14 years earlier. The standard history says that they were first employed on the battlefield in World War I in 1914. But there's very clear evidence, looking at Chinese sources, that they were employed in a battle in which the Americans, in which Smedley Butler participated, in 1900 in China. So all that's to say that, this is still how war is done, right? War is, it's in a very perverse way, but like there's technology, there's learning, there's experimentation, there's development, there's theory, there's debates over the theories, and ultimately the battlefield is the laboratory for this kind of science. I mean, it's a sick science, but it's a science. And so a lot of the techniques are learned in the wars against Native Americans. This remain, all of these things remain part of the lexicon of the U.S. military in a lot of ways up until this day. Certainly in like the Vietnam War, if you look at, letters and documentaries from then, people often talk about going into Indian country, by which they meant like into hostile zones, controlled by the Viet Minh or the Viet Cong. Then at the same time,
was it the boondocks, which was one term that was taken from the Philippines as well?
Yeah. So boondock, it basically comes from a term that means like mountain, but it means wilderness. It comes to mean wilderness. And so the Americans start saying that they're heading into the boondocks to fight against the Filipinos. Once the Filipinos are very badly outmatched on the battlefield and sort of a straight fight, so they start adopting guerrilla tactics, which then draw the Americans further into the boonies. The boonie hat is still like I think to this day, the floppy hat that does some of the branches of the U.S. Armed Forces wear. They still call it a boonie hat. There's other terms as well that I'm not pulling off the top of my head, but there are others as well. But yeah, so all these things really come out of the cauldron of this time. The other thing, and I don't know if I'm getting too far ahead of ourselves here, but a thing that Smedley Butler is personally involved in, he plays a really lead role in, is the development of counterinsurgency theory, or coin. He really develops it in Haiti, which is a place that he's posted for a really significant portion of his career, and it's actually where I encountered him first in terms of like our.
Yeah, I was wondering where you first encountered him, so that makes sense because he was there in 1915.
Yeah, exactly. I first encountered Smedley Butler when I moved to Haiti in 2007. So we lived in the same place fourth dimensionally. He shows up in some histories of Haiti because he's a very important person in the U.S. occupation of Haiti, which happens from 1915 to 1934. Butler is part of the initial invasion force, and then he plays a significant role in setting up the occupation, including setting up a colonial military constabulary, which ends up becoming the Haitian Armed Forces, which has been disbanded and is now back. But one of the things about him that's interesting, and I think this is like one of the things that makes him, a more subtle character, is that he's serving in Haiti under Littleton Waller,
right,
who is a dyed-in-the-wool white supremacist, extremely racist, from an old slaveholding family in Virginia. One of his ancestors was the enslaver of Kunta Kinte. For people who are familiar with, he was the enslaver of an enslaved person named Toby Waller,
okay,
who Alex Haley identifies as Kunta Kinte in roots. Okay, but anyway, there's a rabbit hole there. But it just gives you a sense of who this guy is. He's super, super racist. A lot of the Marines are, because a lot of the Marines come from the South. And this is, a period of high Jim Crow lynchings, the whole nine. It really is the establishment of the Jim Crow South is kind of happening at this same time. It's happening in the same period. And Butler comes from Philadelphia.
right.
He's a Quaker. His family was adamantly anti-slavery. In fact, both of his grandfathers, like him, made an odd choice for Quakers, and they both served in the Union Army during the Civil War, because for some Quakers, the need to abolish slavery was more important than the need to adhere to their peace testimony. And at least that's how they felt their moral drive drove them at the time. And so Butler comes from a family that is not racist. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily anti-racist. By the time he's growing up, they just kind of don't think about race.
Right.
They just if you ask them, they would say of course, we're against slavery. And his attitude is very different from that of a Waller, But he has a lot of just sort of deeply ingrained, kind of white supremacist attitudes that are just sort of, typical of white Americans at that time.
And just to interject, I mean, there were a lot of, I think, policy debates too at the time. I don't know if it was between Chaffee and, was it Taft? I can't remember, but like very minute differences. And, either, we want to support our sort of like brown brothers, so to speak.
Exactly.
And then the opposite of that would be, we should just slaughter all of them. But implicit in both positions is that those people abroad are essentially not really, first-class citizens, and they're inferior to white Americans.
Yeah, those are the two flavors at the time. Like, you could either be like, so William Howard Taft, who is a colonial governor of the Philippines, obviously ends up becoming president of the United States and then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His position is he somewhat infamously in the Philippines today, infamously to even modern day Filipinos, calls Filipinos our little brown brothers.
Right.
And he says that, in time and with like great American care, like they can learn Anglo-Saxon principles. And then the other flavor is just like kill them all. And Chaffee comes from the,
not a Metallic album, but actually, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Basically. Chaffee, and as we noted, he comes from the experience in the wars against the Native Americans. Waller is from a similar background. Certainly, is a like a hardcore white supremacist, and Waller is the guy who actually leads the march on Samar. So he's actually the guy on the ground who leads this revenge massacre and the atrocities that the Americans commit on Samar in 1901. He is then Butler's senior commander in Haiti during the invasion. And Waller is just like, I mean, what Waller would want to do to Filipinos, he wants to do like 10 times over to Haitians, because Haiti occupies a really central place in the American imagination, specifically in the Southern American imagination. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Americans who become the Confederacy ultimately are living white Americans are living in abject fear of the Haitian Revolution basically coming to their shores, and the people that they're enslaving doing what the Haitians did and rising up against the power and freeing themselves and in some cases taking revenge against their masters. And there are reasons for them to be concerned about this because Black people, African Americans, are learning from Haiti. They're aware in some cases of what has happened in Haiti, and there are actually some small attempts to rise up that are in some cases inspired directly by events that happened there. John Brown is like he's reading the biography of Toussaint Louverture, who's one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution, in his cell as he's waiting to be hanged for trying to incite a slave rebellion. Right? So Littleton Waller grows up like hearing about this place. He doesn't even call it Haiti, because he calls it Saint-Domingue, because that's the old French colonial name.
Right.
It was sort of it was like a kind of a 19th century like white supremacist trolling to call Haiti by its colonial name, by its slave name, essentially. And Waller is just like, let's just kill all these people. Let's just kill them until they submit to American rule. Butler, because he comes from a different background and is in some ways able to see Haitians more as people than his commanding officers, especially Waller, he is like, no, like we could actually work with some of these people, right? We can work with villagers. We can create daylight between, some of the rural villagers, some of the peasants, paysans, they call them in Haiti, and the insurgents, the Cacos, who are fighting against the Americans. And this ends up becoming both much more effective and also more destructive, because by working with the local population, by enlisting Haitians as this armed constabulary force, by inventing counterinsurgency, he makes a much more durable occupation, and a much more effective and ultimately a much more brutal occupation than it probably would have been otherwise, or at least that it might have been otherwise. And his tactics, the tactics that he and his Marines invent in the mountains of northern Haiti, they write down, and those notes become the small wars manual of the U.S. military, and they basically become the basis of counterinsurgency theory. And in 2004, James Mattis, when his troops were going to Iraq, he ordered all of he encouraged, but he was obviously their commanding officer, so he basically ordered his officers and his non-coms to read the Small Wars Manual to go back to the things that the Smedley Butler was coming up. So that legacy is still very much part of the U.S. military.
Well, to talk about James Mattis, because you also brought him up in the Filipino context, because you were traveling to the Philippines as you were doing research on Smedley Butler. So you actually, you traveled to a lot of different places that you discuss in the book. So I guess you could call it a past or present frame is how you've discussed it. I don't know if there's an actual literary term for it, but you're discussing the historical event, and then you actually visited these places and spoke to people there and did research. So when you're in the Philippines, you went to the place of the Balangiga massacre. And I think at the time, Duterte was president, and he wanted to get these two bells back from the U.S. because the U.S., I think they stole these two bells that they were, I don't know, they have some sort of historical significance.
They were church bells.
Church bells, right.
Yeah, and Balangiga is a small town, so and it's the church is a very important part of the town. And so basically what ends up happening is that during the revenge for this massacre, the Americans burn the town of Balangiga to the ground. They destroy the church and they take the bells from the church. The Americans believe, and still believe to this day, people who are very deeply seeped in American military lore, still believe that these bells were rung to signal the beginning of the massacre of the Americans. It's a little unclear whether that's true or not, but it doesn't really matter. We're talking historical memory.
Right.
To some extent, what matters is what people believe. And so the Americans take these bells as revenge. They take them as war trophies, and they house them at what's first an army base in Wyoming, becomes an Air Force base, and then another one of them ends up actually in Korea because of the movement of the unit who is involved in this campaign, the Army unit. And for well over 100 years, almost 120 years, the people of Balangiga especially, they want the bells back.
Yeah.
And the bells, in a lot of ways, they become, the French term is lieu de mémoire. It's like a site of memory, right? Which could be statues or sites of memory. Places can be sites of memory. Films and books can sometimes be sites of memory, but this is a very physical and tangible site of memory, in which all of kind of they almost become like a Horcrux from Harry Potter, right? It's they become almost a thing in which all of these feelings about American imperialism writ large, the Filipino-American War, the domination of the Philippines by other empires as well. They all kind of, and of course the memory of this particular revenge massacre, they all kind of get stored, psychically in these bells. And Duterte is, he's an interesting figure. He's trying to sort of play the U.S. and China off one another. He, is eager to maintain U.S. support. He likes his ties with Donald Trump, who's president of the United States at the time. And, but he also he kind of, in a way that Filipino presidents typically hadn't up until this point. The Philippines for many years in this interim are ruled by the Marcos dictatorship. Ferdinand Marcos Sr., his son is now the president of the Philippines. And Imelda Marcos is the wife of Senior, and Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos kind of they it's a period called martial law, but they control the Philippines as a kind of a one-man dictatorship, with the blessing of the U.S., especially the Reagan administration ultimately, until he's overthrown by a popular uprising in the Philippines in 1986. And so all that's to say, like, it's pretty rare for a Filipino president in all this time to bring up the Filipino-American War. But Duterte does. And he makes a big deal about wanting to get these bells back. And when I visited there, like, especially when I went to Balangiga, like, everybody, like, in town was like, oh, have you seen the bells? Like, can you get a message to us that we want the bells back? Somebody asked me if it's true the bells are made of solid gold.
Gold, right.
Yeah, they're not. The gold would be not.
So fast forward, Mattis actually does give the bells back to Duterte. And the reason I brought it up is more of a question of collective memory, because Mattis, in doing so, he's not really giving into the Philippines. He's actually saying, like, these bells represented, marking of time, but the courage of our soldiers is, timeless, something like that. So he actually spins it, and he's saying, our troops were incredibly heroic, and giving this symbolic site of memory back to the Philippines is in no way, trying to rewrite our own history. So in a way, like, collective memory there is not being changed, and if anything, it's actually being weaponized, which I thought was really interesting. So I guess on both sides there are different perceptions of their own history and of collective memory as well.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting. I mean, in some ways, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Redeemer period in the U.S., when the North and the South, like the former North and the former South, came together. Really, in the Spanish-American War specifically,
the Redemption era, right?
Yeah, the Redemption era. Yeah. There are these ways in which the myth of the lost cause in the Confederacy gets kind of, in some ways, adopted by the North, and it kind of turns into, and like, this really kind of sticks with American culture up until this day. I mean, there are I'm blanking on the name of the scholar. I believe I can remember it later. But there are a number of scholars who have noted that this is essentially it's basically like a union, no pun intended, between the whites of the North and the whites of the South, with each other and capital, and there are compromises that, to further a military project, and there are compromises made in this rapprochement, which include basically the North for much of the 20th century, basically until the 1960s. There are exceptions, but ultimately sort of tolerating to some extent, like, Jim Crow segregation, right? They're kind of like...
Right, it's like the legislation that was signed at the time was kind of cementing the exploitation of Black people, even though slavery had been abolished. So it was like another way of perpetrating those inequalities.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, slavery had been abolished, and actually, in the Reconstruction era, like, formerly enslaved people, black men, are holding office in the South, and basically the agreement that has come to between sort of Northern capital and Southern capital is to just sort of like unite and like let bygones be bygones on their side, but then just sort of cut out the Black population entirely. And there is something kind of similar to in what Mattis is doing here, just like rhetorically, especially. It's kind of like, there's a way that after two sides who have been at war are no longer at war with one another, they can use their common experience of having been at war as a way to bond. It's a very strange thing, and it requires, like, it actually sort of, it kind of almost depends on, like, very imprecise language and, like, a healthy dose of historical amnesia. But he's kind of doing that because he's sort of like, he's in the Philippines talking about how brave America's soldiers are. And he has to do that also, right? Because he's the Secretary of Defense, Trump's Secretary of Defense. And also, like, it was not without controversy, like, especially, within the Republican Party, to, like, give these bells back. So he's just, so some ways he has to, pay lip service and make it very clear that this is not a capitulation. We're not surrendering. We're not saying that in retrospect, you guys actually won the war. We're just doing this as kind of a friendship gesture so that the Philippines and the United States can form more of a united front against China. I mean, I think that's really, that from the perspective of the defense establishment, especially, I think from Trump's perspective, I don't even know what Trump thought about this, if he was even aware it was happening. If he was aware, he may have just been like, yeah, like Rodrigo Duterte is a good guy. Like, let's do him a solid. Like, I like it. He's one of my kind of dictator. I like him. But I think from the perspective of the defense establishment, the national security establishment, especially, like the Philippines is a really, really important geographic location now, as it was in 1899, 1900, because of its position specifically with regard to China.
Well, and that's why you had that 2 years later during COVID, you had that Pentagon operation trying to spread misinformation to convince Filipinos not to take the Sinovac vaccine so that they would, to create distrust towards China, essentially, and to exploit that and to try to position the Philippines more on the side of U.S. empire as on the side of China.
Yeah, I mean, like if you look at a map, the Philippines are they're almost sort of like large 7,000 like extremely large barrier islands in a way off of Asia, and they're directly positioned to for force deployment and force projection toward China, and the reason why. So even in World War II, on December 7th and December 8th, because of the international dateline, 1941, the Japanese attack at the same time that they attack Pearl Harbor. They attack the Philippines and they attack a number of other colonial possessions, both American and British, in the Pacific Rim. But in a lot of ways, like what Japan is really trying to do in the war, and this is very clear if you sort of look at the scope of American-Japanese relations over the 40 years leading up to this, basically from the Boxer Rebellion to 1941. It is very much that the United States controls the Philippines, which then allows the United States to project force and control, or at least have significant military influence over the Asian mainland. And Japan wants that, right? Because in a lot of ways, in the Pacific, the war between the United States and Japan is really a war over control of China. That's in a lot of ways, that's actually what's happening here. And so that's why, the Japanese, and there's a whole chapter in Gangsters about an earlier Pacific War scare in 1907, when Smedley Butler is based in another part of the Philippines, in a spot called Subic Bay,
right?
Where he's like, mounting guns. He's installing this gun battery to defend against a feared
Japanese,
like a legitimately feared Japanese attack. So anyway, all of that's to say, like, especially when you're talking about the military, like geography is in a lot of ways destiny, and the Philippines are they're this very important geographic feature that anybody who wants to control the Pacific Rim, and anybody who wants to especially either have power as China or keep China in check wants control over in whatever way is possible. And so so the U.S. then as now, it wants the Philippines both for access to China's markets and also as a counterbalance and a force projection point to stop any kind of Chinese military expansion in the region. And so in a lot of ways, like that's what the return of the bells is in a lot of ways about. It's this gesture that's like, let's let bygones be bygones. And he kind of employs this kind of like redeemer, like redemption era sort of language. That's just sort of like, there were heroes on both sides, and there were some mistakes were made, but didn't we all just come out of that experience just a little
bonding,
a little more manly than we went in?
Right. That was part one of my discussion with Jonathan M. Katz. In part two, we discussed the role that class played in politics at the time of Smedley Butler, as well as the foiled business plot. Thanks for watching.